Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Academic Insights, Discover How Skidmore College Amplifies Its Special Collections, which is sponsored by JSTOR, part of nonprofit Ithaca. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Now, I'll just put a couple links in the chat for where you can register for upcoming Choice ACRL webinars or watch previous Choice ACRL webinar recordings. So, as you're aware, academic and research libraries are currently undergoing a profound transformation, redefining their strategies to support the next generation of learning, instruction, and scholarly exploration. With collections increasingly shifting towards digital formats, the primary challenge lies in seamlessly integrating these resources into academic workflows. Today, we'll delve into how collaborative efforts between the nonprofit JSTOR and esteemed institutions like Skidmore College are helping special collections transcend paywalls, granting researchers open access to primary source materials alongside relevant scholarly content. But before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers or to share any comments. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Also, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. Now, this event is possible thanks to our sponsor, JSTOR, part of the nonprofit Ithaca. JSTOR partners with libraries, museums, and publishers to reduce costs, extend access, and preserve scholarship for the future as affordably and sustainably as possible. They believe education is key to the well-being of individuals and society and work to improve access to knowledge and education for people around the world, along with their nonprofit services, ArtStore, Consulate, Ithaca SNR, Portico, and Reveal Digital. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Today we're joined by Bruce Hederick, Senior Vice President of Open Collections and Infrastructure at JSTOR, and David Seiler, Head of Digital Projects and Collections at Skidmore College. Since joining Ithaca in 1999, Bruce Hederick now leads the strategy and teams that work with libraries around the world to make their collections openly accessible on JSTOR and to use the platform as an increasingly important component of their infrastructure to support teaching and research. David Seiler began his career at Skidmore College in 1998 and now oversees both the college's digital collections of archival materials and the management of the institutional repository. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Bruce.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, wherever you happen to be in the world. Glad you could spend a few minutes with us. Really appreciate that. I wanted to start out by talking about why Ithaca has decided to sort of get into this space of primary source special collections and making them available and preserving them. We were obviously known for a long time and still are about digitizing the back files of journals and getting book content on the platform and other types of content. But we were hearing increasingly from institutions that they were struggling a little bit with their digitized primary source special collections. This tied into some of the research we were seeing from Ithaca SNR as well. We knew that faculty were wanting to teach more with these collections, not only the collections at their own institution, but with these digitized collections at other institutions. And that increased need to teach was the libraries were feeling that pinch a little bit. At the same time, students were wanting to do research with these unique collections more often, particularly early career researchers who were looking for those unique spaces to do their deep research. And we also discovered through our work that in most institutions, and maybe David can confirm this when he's talking, but less than 5% of the physical collections were actually digitized. This was a big question mark for us about how are faculty supposed to teach with these resources and students do the research if such a small percentage of that content was actually digitized. At the same time, we knew that, beyond the fact that students in particular were looking to do their research with digital content more and more, and the pandemic just accelerated that libraries were in this space where they were really, for many, in the midst of this sort of major strategic reinvention, where they're trying to build themselves into the next generation of instruction, learning, and scholarship. And so there was a lot of work going on at the libraries on how to position themselves differently and more effectively in the institution. And that, of course, in the process of doing this, many were moving to a services first model, and that had all kinds of implications on new resources and new kinds of talent and actual infrastructure that was needed. And libraries were going to have to be in the space of making some decisions on whether they build things themselves, whether they partner with like institutions to solve some of these problems, or whether they purchase things from the commercial space. So it seemed like a space that was could use some help, and we were trying to understand whether it was something that we could actually do something transformative in. We also know that most of what we heard from the libraries was that their collections, even if they were digitized, they did not have them in the research workflow or the learning workflow. They were typically siloed, sitting in spaces. Some people knew they were there, most people did not know they were there. And that if libraries were going to, in this sort of repositioning themselves in the institution, going to be able to demonstrate their value more, I guess, emphatically, that these local collections were going to need to be in a place where they could have more impact. And that the current systems that existed for access and discovery really did not bring that content into the research workflow like they would like. So there seemed to be a space there that sounded somewhat familiar to us when people were talking about the back files of journals back in the early 1990s, that they were challenging to find, they were hard to use for researchers, they were complicated to curate and migrate, and then they were taking up space that could be used for other services that libraries wanted to provide. So I show this slide occasionally because we stole this from the Syracuse University website. This is sort of a picture of their tapestry of services and tools that they have. The optimists tell me that this is elegant creativity, and then the pessimists tell me that this looks a little bit more like a dog's breakfast. I think the interesting part is that there are a lot of tools and a lot of services in play for these digitized and born digital collections, whether we're providing access to them or preserving them. And there's a lot of connections that have to be made between these services and these tools. And it's complicated. It's a complicated space. And if we're going to find ways to make it less complicated, more efficient, and cost less, those were sort of some of our goals in thinking about entering into this space. So hearing all this, we decided, well, I mean, we don't really know what type of impact we could have on this at JSTOR. We know we had this platform, which a lot of people in the humanities and social sciences use quite a bit. We also know that we had a preservation solution for published content called Portico. So we said to ourselves, well, what, if we're going to get in and start doing something in this space, what would we do? And do we have a unique set of values to bring to the table that would make it different from other things that are happening? So we weren't quite sure whether we did or not. We had some hypotheses, and let's say, well, let's test them out. Let's just see. So starting around actually right when the pandemic started in March of 2020, we decided to open up the JSTOR platform, allow institutions to start putting their collections onto the JSTOR platform, and started investigating what we would need to do with Portico in order to provide a preservation solution for this content. So our hypotheses were these: that if we could get those collections on the JSTOR platform, that would make them more discoverable. JSTOR is already in the research workflow. It's already a starting place for a lot of students and faculty when it comes to content in humanities and social sciences in particular. And so being in the research workflow already would give this content an advantage of being found and potentially used. The other hypothesis we had was that having these primary source special collections alongside the secondary literature, the books and journals that were already on JSTOR, and having the ability to connect those things would be really helpful to the research process and make it more seamless. We heard from a lot of faculty or a lot of students doing research that one of the problems was they were having to move from sort of primary source content into secondary content. And if we had a way of co-locating that content, that might actually be a real boon in their efficiency of doing their research. And finally, just mission-based, helping institutions who really feel strongly about having long-term preservation for these collections. It is the unique assets of those institutions, being able to take care of those in a more managed preservation way, that we thought that with Portico, we would have bring to the table a solution that might be quite helpful. So for basically 3 years, 2.5 years, we ran this sort of pilot. We did these things for free. We allowed institutions to put their things up and kind of look along with us at what the evidence would tell them. Do they get more usage? What kind of usage is it? Those types of things. How does the presentation look? Is it searchable? Is it just the things you would normally want to look at when you have your content in a particular channel? During that time, we had over 300 institutions put up over 1,800 collections, and that kind of one of the beautiful things we saw was that institutions who might dip their toe in the water with 1 or 2 collections would come back a couple of months later and put a few more in. They were finding that experience to be useful, and they were seeing good results. So they were trying other types of collections to see what would happen. So we had more institutions adding more collections. And of course, we had more and more collections coming on the platform. Usage started to grow. Institutions started to see some really nice bumps in their usage of that content. So it all said to us that there's something here that we might potentially be able to do something transformative. So let's jump in with both feet. I want to give a special shout out to 2 institutions in particular. First is the South Asia Open Archive. That's a Center for Research Libraries sort of project. They had put together a group of 27, 28 institutions who were all contributing content. They decided that they wanted to make that content open access from the get-go, and they wanted to use the JSTOR channel, the JSTOR platform, to make that content available. And so they were kind of like the first set of institutions to sort of latch onto this idea and try to do something as a group, and also to Chatham University, which really was one of the first institutions to really grab onto this idea whole hog and say, hey, let's really try this out. And I think today Chatham has something like 35 collections up on the JSTOR platform and using that effectively there at their institution. So what we found during the charter period was, testing out these hypotheses were a few things. Number one was that a lot of the content that was put up during the charter period was open content, was content that institutions had cleared the rights to make available around the world. And one of the things they were really interested in discovering was actually, did it get out to researchers around the world? And what our data started to show is that actually that was happening. In fact, over 60% of the usage of these collections on JSTOR were actually happening from the open web. They weren't from one of the 14 or 15,000 JSTOR institution IP addresses that we had. They were happening outside of that. So they were actually getting out into the open space. All this content was available openly, whether people had a JSTOR subscription or not. And so it was getting out into those spaces. Still, a lot of the institutions who participate in JSTOR we're using this content as well. As you can see, over 13,000 institutions were accessing this content from over 225 countries. So that footprint for most institutions they were seeing was much larger than anything they felt like they could get on their own. So the scale was very different. Still, though, about 43% of the usage of the content came from people starting at JSTOR. So JSTOR is that starting place, that sort of in the research workflow place. That was confirmed quite a bit with our data. And we also saw that about 31% of the usage was people finding it on Google. Now, that was interesting because that was more than we would typically see of the Google impact on the JSTOR journals and books. It was more elevated. So it sort of showed us how important it was to have good SEO for this content in Google. Okay, so the indexing in Google was sorry, I moved ahead one too many. The indexing in Google was important, and in fact, that's one of the things we started to look at a little bit was having the content itself in JSTOR having an impact on its indexing in Google? And the answer to that was yes. Because JSTOR gets so much usage, having the links to that content in JSTOR was actually helping to amplify the usage, the indexing in Google, and make that content probably more discoverable. And the other thing is that institutions found that the usage on JSTOR was complementary, supplementary to what they were seeing on their own institutional website. So in many instances, like David probably saw at Skidmore, the institution itself was a big driver of usage, but in most cases, they were a small percentage of the overall usage. So that usage was getting out into a much broader audience, and so really outside the institution was a new audience that this content was reaching. So today we have now we have almost 300 institutions participating in our services, growing a little bit every day, and it's been wonderful. Skidmore being one of them, obviously, but there's a lot of growth happening here and a lot of people interested in how they might participate. And one of the things they've told us they're interested in is the sort of componentized nature of our services. What we're doing right now in providing services to build collections through JSTOR form or share them on the JSTOR platform or preserve them in Portico, it's just the start of what our infrastructure services are going to be. So we're just at the beginning of this. The flexibility to choose those services depending on what you needed at that institution was really important. Some were just choosing to share the collections on JSTOR. They're looking for another channel to make that content discoverable and usable. Some desperately needed a preservation solution. They were simply backing stuff up to their institutional servers, and that didn't feel sufficient enough, so they were looking for a preservation solution. And then there were others who were simply looking to replace existing tools and services they already had. They felt that these might be better solutions, so they went so far as to migrate to this set of services. So what have we found is working? Well, I talked a little bit about the JSTOR effect and a little bit about the amplified indexing that we see in Google. Um, we are seeing good success, and I'm going to show this a little later in our presentation about connecting the secondary literature to primary source content and vice versa. There is a lot of wonderful things that can be done in this space, and we're only beginning to touch the surface of it, but we're already seeing some really useful ways that that's happening. Another big thing that most of you may not know is that through what we've been doing with infrastructure services, we're now supporting audio and video on the JSTOR platform. So it's not just text and images that are coming into these collections. We're also getting oral histories now. We're getting video histories, performances, things of this nature. One of the things that we're doing, which people are telling us is very helpful, is we are creating auto-generated transcripts for the stuff that comes onto our platform and providing a mechanism to give those back to the institution. So that's important because that without those transcripts, much of the stuff would be very difficult to find. So that I think is going to be really helpful. And we've linked the transcripts in with the actual audio or video itself. So it's a nice viewing experience there. Finally, we're doing quite a bit of work with Portico. We understand that doing the preservation of locally digitized collections is very different from doing the preservation of published content from publishers. The mechanisms of actually doing the actual preservation are very similar, but the workflows are very different, and how institutions and how publishers want to get in and use that archive. So we're doing quite a bit of work around that. But I think the thing that we've been most pleased with is actually trying to make it very simple for institutions to participate with us. So we have ways that people can publish directly into our space through JSTOR Forum. We've been harvesting content from repositories like Tend or Content DM or Islandora or DSpace. Institutions have been FTPing content to us, which we then can load pretty easily. And then we've also created an easy way for institutions to just take Excel spreadsheets and load stuff in themselves. And that stuff, of course, comes out to JSTOR for online access if that's what an institution wants, or into Portico for preservation. And we're also looking at how to now push this stuff into Constellate for text and data mining, distant reading, and some of the work we're doing with large language models on our own with JSTOR's research assistant. We'll be looking at how we get these digital collections into those solutions as well. So there's a lot going on in this space. As I said, we've jumped in with both feet. We're really looking at where we can have, even though we're still a small not-for-profit, looking at where we can have the most impact we can have for libraries. I'm going to transition it over to David here. I think Skidmore is a really interesting example and a common example for us. They already have a repository of record, and they're using our infrastructure services to complement and supplement what they currently have. So it's a really interesting story. And David, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. So what I'd like to do first is just briefly outline the history of Skidmore College before I move to a timeline of the history of our digital collections. I'll then discuss our current collaboration with JSTOR, and finally our preservation efforts utilizing Portico. For those of you who don't know, Skidmore College is located in Saratoga Springs, New York. It's about 3 hours north of New York City. It's home to the country's oldest horse racing track and also mineral springs, from which it gets its name. And both of these attractions were popular during Lucy Skidmore Scribner's time when she first came to Saratoga, and continue to be today. So she settled here in 1903 for health reasons, and she saw a need, and so she started the Young Women's Industrial Club to provide practical training to young women and girls in order for them to become self-supporting. Courses were offered in sewing, millinery, cooking, music, etc. It was a modest beginning, as seen here in the first building the club occupied, but Lucy Scribner was passionate, and the club proved wildly successful. In 1911, The school was granted a provisional charter by the Board of Regents. It expanded into a new building seen here on the right and was renamed the Skidmore School of Arts. It served as a technical school, a vocational school with graduates qualified for state positions and were granted teacher certificates. In 1917, an amendment to the charter authorized the administration of courses leading to a bachelor's degree. And finally, in 1922, Skidmore School of Arts became what we know today, Skidmore College, an all-women's school at the time and a 4-year degree granting institution. In the 1960s, though, Skidmore had outgrown its downtown location. It was previously located in the downtown of Saratoga Springs, and they were really sort of flummoxed as to what to do. A trustee had stepped in, purchased a large tract of land where we are now located. You can see in this picture on the right. The move began in 1964 with the first academic building, the library, which I'm sitting in right now, that building, that square building in the upper right of the image there, and with the first residential quadrangle in the lower left of the image. And as you can see from the title of the newspaper clipping, expect completion of the project in the early 1970s. Well, that was rather wishful thinking. In fact, it wasn't until 2006 when the college really officially completed the move to this campus with the closing of the last dorm on Union Avenue. And in 1971, the trustees approved coeducation at the college, and the college sort of became the institution that we know today. But I would like to just a little aside in that history of coeducation, the Young Women's Industrial Club and the Skidmore School of Arts both admitted young men, and in fact, many attended, and they were granted degrees from the Skidmore School of Arts. It wasn't until 1914 that the college, or excuse me, that the school became exclusively for women. And then once more again after the Second World War, in response to the GI Bill, the college opened an auxiliary campus in Glens Falls, New York, a town just north of Saratoga, and men attended Skidmore and graduated between the years of 1946 and 1951. So now I'd just like to take you on a little story of my own journey and the journey of our digital collections here at the college, and it might look familiar to many of you. And as Sabrina stated earlier, I started in 1998. When I started, I was the visual resources curator managing a physical slide library, which was housed in the library itself. There were no digital assets at that point in time, and it really wasn't until 2004 when we adopted JSTOR that the first inklings of digital collections sort of made themselves manifest. And during that time leading up to 2006, we started to create digital objects and visual resources. In 2006, we transitioned to an all digital practice, no longer producing any physical slides. And it was at that time that we also started digitizing collections that were unique to us, including the Maureen O'Brien Mazer Memorial Collection, a collection of slides of Mesoamerican sites that were taken during the 1930s through the 1950s. We shared that with JSTOR. It sort of, in some ways, can be seen as a precursor to some of the things that we're doing today. It also is just shows that there was a long-standing relationship with Ithaca itself. And at the same time, we initiated, or excuse me, we became part of the hosted pilot program where we hosted our visual resources collection alongside JSTOR's material. Again, sort of in some ways a similar idea of what Bruce is just talking about earlier. So there are some really early precursors to this notion. In 2011, we became one of the first 25 subscribers to Shared Shelf. We started at that point, we started cataloging our materials and uploading them into JSTOR through Shared Shelf. And during a renovation, we actually eliminated the entire physical slide collection. In 2012, we migrated our entire visual resources collection to Shared Shelf, and at the same time started a new focus within the library on digitizing the archival collections within special collections. And you can see the next bullet, we adopted Content DM for the new digital collections. And I just want to make a note here that in some ways, this is where two different ideas sort of split: the notion of what is visual resources and the notion of what is digital collections, and that plays a role in what happened in the future. In 2013, the college adopted Digital Commons as its institutional repository. I took over management of that in 2020. And in 2017, Shared Shelf transitioned into JSTOR Forum. And I just want to pause here for a second and say that simultaneously in these years between 2013 and 2019, we were in the process of furiously digitizing our archival materials within special collections. At the same time, the visual resources work was happening. It was starting to lessen, but those two things were going in opposite directions. And so the notion of finding in 2019, which we did, we were looking for a new solution to content EM because we are a small institution, a small department. The library itself is only about 23 full-time people. And in order for us to mount content EM, it was requiring about 3 or 4 different staff members at various moments in the process. And that was becoming sort of untenable for us. So we were looking for a solution that might sort of alleviate that problem. And for us, it became TIN Digital Archive, which we now use, and which we manage our digital collections and as sort of our main access point. But in 2020, obviously during the pandemic, as Bruce was saying, we were made aware of and invited to participate in the Open Community Collections pilot. And for us, in some ways, it was a no-brainer because we had maintained JSTOR Forum this entire time. We will continue to maintain it because we have our legacy visual resources collection. We also have a collection from the Tang Teaching Museum as well. So we're committed to having that for long term. And so we decided to share a few collections. And as Bruce was alluding to, once we did a few, we added a couple of more and continue to add as we see fit. 2022, we retired the visual resources moniker and adopted digital projects and collections again, just to sort of reflect the work as it stands now, because the work of what was visual resources really no longer happens. And then finally, in 2023, we became early adopters of preserving collections with Portico. So I'll talk briefly about the collections that we have within the open community collections and sort of why these particular collections. And I think for us, it was the notion that these collections would most likely have appeal beyond just the Skidmore campus. So what I should say about the digital collections themselves is that our intent was really always an internal audience. We were really looking to make the accessibility of those collections greater for the local Skidmore audience, in the sense that anyone could be able to search those collections, whether they be yearbooks, student newspapers, catalogs, etc., to be able to do some of the research and some of the just basic work that they do for departments, of course, special collections, most importantly, but then alumni affairs, advancement, etc. Whereas these collections that we have here might have a broader appeal. So the first one I'll mention is the Anita Pondorf Yates collection of Saratogiana, a collection of prints of Saratoga and its environs from the 19th century, many of which are from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. The next collection, which I think Bruce will touch on a little bit later, is this Elizabeth Fisher Adams collection, documents, photographs, letters, all from a selection of things from her time in France during the Second World War as part of a member of an ambulance crew. Next, the Bolster photograph collection, which is Skidmore specific collection. It's photographic documentation of student life from the 1920s to the 1950s. And then a letter collection, which is quite a hodgepodge, but there are a few interesting things. In particular, I'll point out that there's some letters from William Seward, who was a former governor of New York State, who was writing with respect to an insanity defense plea that he was about to put forward in a murder trial, which was the first instance of such a use of such a defense in the US. And then finally, the Patricia Ann Lee land grants, which are a collection of documents, land transfers from the 16th to the 18th century that were donated by a history professor. And I'm pointing these out because in 2014, we had conservation done to them. And then once that conservation was complete, I digitized all of these documents. And the hope was that at some point, someone would take an interest in transcribing, translating, etc. They're written in Latin, in Scots, and in French. And this seemed like the perfect thing to go into this open community collections. And not surprisingly, a little surprisingly to me though, was it happened locally. It didn't happen outside of Skidmore, but I just want to point this out because this is the kind of engagement that really you can only hope for. So I really want to make note of this. And this was a history professor here, Jordana Dim, in her archival storytelling class in the fall of 2022 and spring of 2023. I really recommend that you go look at this site. They really did an amazing job. It's called Lost in Transcription, Found in Translation. The students taught themselves how to read secretary hand, and they quite painstakingly went through documents line by line, letter by letter, and really fleshed out these documents in a way that really wouldn't have been possible for us to do without their work. So that allowed us to then augment the records for everyone. And then finally, I just want to talk very briefly about preservation. And when we were in the process of sort of discussing this webinar, Bruce asked me about, why is preservation important to you? And I didn't have a ready answer for him, but I thought about it a lot. And I think one of the things that might be true of other places, it's true here, is that we actually do not have a dedicated archivist on campus. So it really falls to my colleague in special collections, the head of special collections, Wendy Anthony, and her team to sort of preserve what it is that we have here on campus. And in fact, there was not a special collections department at the college until 1995. So what we have contained in special collections is really only the luck of having people over the course of the history of the college actually saving material, setting it aside, making it available, and the fact that it's in analog form, that it survived in the way that it is. So this timeline starts at 2014, partly because up until that point, really, what was being preserved was things related to the visual resources collection, the TIFF files of the images that were being digitized up until that point. They were residing on a local server. It was a running joke in the department that IT would ask every year, why is this so big? Do you really need it? And we would say, yes, we need to keep it. And so finally, once we started digitizing things from our special collections, the amount of space, the amount of files, et cetera, just grew exponentially. So they decided that they would set aside an Amazon S3 bucket for us. And then essentially that's where things resided for about 10 years. And that it worked fine. But in 2023, as you can see, they informed us that they would no longer be able to maintain that. It was becoming unsustainable from a cost perspective. Coincidentally, I happened to be watching a webinar with Bruce, The Future of JSTOR Open Community Collections, where he laid out some of these issues and started talking about Portico as a way to preserve collections. We, as I said earlier, we already subscribed to JSTOR Forum. So to utilize Portico was really it was an extra cost, but it was a nominal cost. And I believe were the first participants. And it's been going smoothly ever since. And with that, I think I'll stop there and turn it back to Bruce.
Thank you, David. I don't know, David, if you want to say anything about your storage here, and
Oh, yeah, I forgot about the slide. I'm
that's
sorry.
okay.
So here's just a quick visualization of what we have. So about 20 plus collections, 5 terabytes and growing of material. 275,000 is probably actually closer, maybe a little bit closer to 400,000 digital objects, kind of files, from TIFF files, PDFs, normal stuff, text files, audio files, etc. So a wide range of things. And I think there was one point I did want to make that, so thank you for letting me speak again, Bruce, which was, I think in terms of preservation, what it is from my perspective is that the collections that I'm digitizing, I have no worries that those things will be around in 20, 30, 40 years because they're analog materials. So as long as someone doesn't throw them out, they'll be there. But what I am creating in terms of what I'm doing with digitization, with OCR work, et cetera, is a level of accessibility to those collections that I'm interested in preserving, so that if I'm not at the institution, that accessibility will not go away. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Um, Thank you, David. I wanted, we only have a couple minutes left before we jump into the Q&A, and I wanted to show a couple of things to the audience. The first one is we've created a online dashboard that institutions who are participating can go in and look at their data at any time. And I just wanted to give people a sense of what this looks like. So this is Skidmore with the collections they have up on JSTOR. Uh, the photograph collection is driving a lot of the usage here. I think about 35% of the usage. It's also the biggest collection, I think, is David, if I'm correct. It has the most items in it anyway.
Yes.
So one of the things that's interesting is not only can you see your usage in different time periods with this dashboard, but you can also see what's driving the usage, which items are driving the usage, which institutions are driving the usage, which countries. And, to David's earlier point about, really interested in this stuff getting to his constituencies at Skidmore, Skidmore is is the institution driving a lot of the usage, but it's a much longer tail. So while Skidmore is the highest institutional driver, it's only 20% of the usage of those collections. As the dark blue shows here, this is what people are actually finding from the open web, and this lighter blue over here is what institutions are finding from JSTOR participating institutions. So we tried to give a snapshot, a dashboard for people to look at so they can see where their collections might be having impact, and which collections are having impact, and which items in those collections are having impact. And that's really interesting. I think the other interesting thing about the Skidmore usage is that almost 50% of it is being driven by people starting at JSTOR. That's sort of the referring, the most heavy refer, and Google's about 26% of the usage that's being driven. So it's not too far out of line of what we've seen across the board, but it is a little bit different. So obviously institutions can can look at this usage and pull out their own little nuggets of information that might be helpful in judging their impact. The other thing I want to say is that, like David mentioned at Skidmore, we have about 200 institutions that are using JSTOR Forum to build their collections. And traditionally, they were using Forum to build them for their art collections, either for their visual resources collections or for their slide collection, whatever happened to be. What we're finding with those institutions, and more of them are thinking about, okay, well, how do we leverage that investment a little more? How do we use that to get other content at the library into the JSTOR channel, and be able to sort of leverage that investment across the broader library? So we're seeing that happen at institutions like Johns Hopkins and others, which we think is going to be very beneficial in the long run. Before we go to the Q&A, I want to walk you through a little bit of I talked about the connecting of secondary and primary literature here. So March is Women's History Month. And I thought I'd show an example of someone just doing a Google search on Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. They find a JSTOR link in that result set. When they go to that, link, they're taken to a journal article from, I think, 2008 in the history teacher. But over on the left frame is actually where we've started to sort of make these connections to related text and related images. And one of the related images here is something that's in the Elizabeth Fisher Adams collection. So someone could be reading this article, come over, look at the related images, find this image, and it would take them into the collection that Skidmore has put up, the Elizabeth Fisher Adams collection. And then this allows the person who's using this to either look for other things in this collection or to go back and see what else the Skidmore has put into here. So one of the ways, the architecture of how this was set up is that not only is this content indexed in JSTOR, but you have the ability to search just within the institution itself or just within the collection itself. So it allows people different ways of coming into that content to find things they're interested in. So the idea that someone can do a Google search and get to an object, or frankly can find an object on Google and get to a journal article or book chapter that might be written about that object, is what we're trying to accomplish here with the work that we're doing with connecting these secondary and primary resources. So I just want to say again that there's still so much that we're going to be able to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning to connect these resources. We've only honestly touched the surface of it. And we really think that's going to be really valuable, having this content located together so that we can make those connections and frankly make the research process more seamless. So finally, before I move into the Q&A, I just want to reemphasize that with our infrastructure services, we're really just at the beginning of this. We found some good solutions for sharing and for preserving and even for building, but there's a lot more to come. We're in this with both feet. We're looking for ways to be transformative as part of our mission, and we're really looking forward to working with institutions in that vein. So if you didn't think about, hey, we want to try this out, we're really interested in working with you, obviously. This has really some incredible benefits of scale. The more collections we can get into that space, obviously, the more of the network effect that we can find with connecting this content together. And we're really looking forward to what that brings to the scholarly community when that happens. And with that, I will turn it over to the folks to go through the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bruce and David. Looks like we already got some questions in the Q&A, so I'll just remind attendees, feel free to drop in more questions. We have about 12 minutes left. First, I'll just kick it off with a question to David. Can you explain your rationale for having collections spread about multiple platforms rather than just one?
Sure. I think that's probably the case for a lot of institutions. Some of that is just a function of the fact that the decisions were made at various points in time that weren't taking into account everything as a whole, and then specifically to, I think quite simply, there is not one solution for all of the problems. But we have found that, or I should say that I think we've tried to winnow it down as much as we possibly can, and then take advantage in cases like this where we can sort of leverage our collections on multiple platforms with things that we already subscribe to. And so that's the reason for it.
Great, thank you. And I want to get to a question from Francesca that came in pretty early on. who asks, can you tell us more about the work with Research Assistant and LLMs, large language models? Do schools have the option to opt out of including local collections for the LLM? Maybe you are not that far in this work, but since it was mentioned, I wanted to ask. Bruce, I think this is for you.
A great question. And no, we aren't far enough along to know how we intend to do that. I will say our work in this space right now is in beta. We have, I think, a few tens of thousands of people using the beta, our research assistant on JSTOR. And I think the idea is that there's a number of institutions who want to make sure that, in an ethical way, that this content gets into models that we might be using on JSTOR so that it isn't marginalized, quite honestly. And so we're gonna be looking at ways to do that in an effective and ethical way. And the reason I put that on the slide is just to signal that we know that's something that institutions are curious about and that we'll be working to try to find solutions for.
Great, thank you. And then another question for David. Can you comment on how you deal with born digital objects as it relates to access and preservation?
Sure, that's a great question. I think that's the big burning question for a lot of us, because it's very easy to for me to talk about the analog. As I alluded to, the analog material will be around well after I'm gone. The born digital stuff, we really do not have a specific plan. That's part of the problem. So we're already a quarter of a century into this century of born digital objects, and there's no cohesive plan. And part of that is just, particular to our institution. I'm sure it's the case in a lot of institutions. So right now, we're completely reliant on what people are saving and retaining, and that's pretty limited. So I think I've already run into issues where I've had to rely on the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine in order to reproduce things, and that's clearly not a sustainable future, but that's where we find ourselves.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions about metadata, so I'll try to, I think, combine a couple. But Donna asks, what are costs? What are the metadata standards? How is metadata entered? And who to contact to get more information. But I know there were two questions that asked about what are the metadata standards that you use. Bruce, maybe
Yeah.
to
All
this.
right. So let me back up for a second, because when we when we um, when we take on collections, we take on the metadata and the objects themselves. So that's a little bit different from some other models like, say, DPLA, which might just take the metadata. So whatever metadata you bring to the table is what we take on. We have a metadata schema, which is sort of a blown out version of Dublin Core, to accommodate lots of different metadata types. But a lot of what we've taken on has been harvested through OAI PMH. So whatever content's coming out is kind of, we map it to our metadata schema, which is typically more robust than the metadata that we're actually receiving. So it's sort of a super metadata schema, I would call it. It's not, it has VRA elements in it, it has Dublin Core elements in it, it has lots of other elements in it. So when we're taking that on, we don't touch the metadata. The metadata is what you send to us. So we are not sort of adding things to the metadata to change the metadata you've provided to us. That's a very important aspect of this. We have been asked to consider providing metadata enhancement services where institution could say to us, hey, I know you're finding named entities and creating collections as data for a lot of the things that you're doing on JSTOR. Could you offer those similar services to us, because we don't have the resources at our institution to actually optimize our metadata for distant reading or to meet accessibility mandates we have currently, or whatever that happens to be. And we're considering that as a possible infrastructure service that we might offer.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. We have another question from Donna, who asks, is there integration with EBSCO Discovery Service or with Archive Space?
So we syndicate all the content that is openly available out to EBSCO, EDS, or OCLC WorldCat, or Clarivate, Alma Primo, on a regular basis for them to include in their discovery service applications. We don't have a specific interface with Archive Space at the moment, but it's one of the things that from this last round of sort of research we've been doing that we're going to explore.
Okay, great. And sort of an add-on to that, Julia asks if there's integration with Omeka, Digital Commons, or DPLA.
Sorry, David. I feel like I'm taking over here. So we have the ability to syndicate content out to DPLA or out to Omeka when people put things in shared collections. We had that ability with shared shelf, and through JSTOR Forum we can do that activity. What was the last one you asked about? Sorry, it was
No, it's okay.
DPLA, Omeka, and I lost the last one.
Digital Commons.
Oh, Digital Commons. So we don't syndicate to Digital Commons at this stage. And that service that we've talked about is an actual broader syndication service. We have harvested a lot of content from Digital Commons into shared collections.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. We have a question from Elizabeth who asks, could you explain how we could network on digital collection and sharing of resources? And maybe that's something you both could talk about, or specifically Bruce, but
Well, so we have a number of examples of people who are, I guess I'd say, attempting to I guess collaborate together as institutions into a single thing. So, as I mentioned earlier, the South Asia Open Archive is really a prima facie example of that. Multiple institutions have come together, brought content to the space, and have created a single entry point for access to the South Asia Open Archive in an open access way. We have other institutions who have been talking about that. We have a consortium in California, SCELC, who's actually providing a set of digital cooperative services where they're looking to bring their memberships collections together and to be discoverable and usable as sort of an aggregated entity that way. So there's lots of possibilities around that that obviously we're happy to explore. That's the whole idea, is being able to sort of virtually connect these collections in a way that institutions would like to see. And obviously, down the road, we see ways of coming into the collections on JSTOR in different ways. It'd be nice to look across all the World War II postcards that 50 institutions have put in there, and being able to have like almost an entry point into a thematic area or into a content area.
Thank you. Let's see, we have time for maybe one or two more. There's one here for David. Sherry asks, if you have a book in a special collections and there already exists a PDF of that book in an open access collection through perhaps the Internet Archive or Google, do you still digitize that material? Goes on to say, it reminds me of the age-old issue in visual resources of why are we all creating a copy of the Mona Lisa as opposed to sharing from a small pool created of the work.
Exactly. I can sort of give one example. We have a collection in special collections called the Norman Fox collection of illustrated books, mostly from the 19th century. And there are a lot of those things. There's a large selection of which are Cruikshank materials, and a lot of those are available publicly. And sometimes it's a matter of deciding whether what's available is actually of a high enough quality that we might go ahead and do that. So we do it on a case-by-case basis. If there's something, and in our archive and our special collections is not as vast as it might be at other institutions. There aren't as many very precious objects, if you will, as there are at other places. But really, it's a case-by-case basis. So we decide, can we do it better? Can we bring something, put something out there that will augment what's there or improve what's there? And that's the decision-making process.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, looks like we're out of time, but to anyone whose question wasn't answered, JSTOR will aim to follow up with you and answer your questions. And since we're at the end, I'll just say thanks so much to Bruce and David for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you to our attendees for your questions and comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from JSTOR with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session and hope to see you again soon on another webinar.
Thanks, everybody.